Hmm. I have sent you the course outline as well as your MS Team codes to join your respective sections. Please join your respective sections and continue with that. Don't change your sections. That will create problem for you. Before going forward, do you have any questions or any clarifications regarding what we had discussed earlier in terms of your course outline as well as your exam schedule, so forth? No. In that case, what we'll do is we'll move to we'll start our formal lecture sort of thing from today. Today we have 2 hours lecture, 10 to 12. We'll continue without a break and I will leave you a bit early. Is it fine?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
Oh,
sir.
okay. Hopefully you can see my screen. Is my screen visible? Can you?
Yes, sir, it's visible.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Oh, okay. So what we'll do today is we are going to look at the world around us, how it has looked like in terms of economic indicators. Let's say from 1000 years duration. Before going to look at the graph where we'll see how the world looked like maybe in the last 1000 years or so, let's have a quick look at recent news articles that has those have been put forth by various news agencies. Here you can see I had taken some of the screenshot from the news article, news agencies, and we see the headline suggests that GDP collapsed from 23.9% in Q1, and the headline is consistent across all the news agencies. The obvious question arises, how this news agency reached at this number? Why not 10% or 20% collapse or contraction of our GDP? But 23.9%. how we reach at those numbers. This is one part of the story we are going to discuss in our national income accounting. So these numbers, in case of India, we have one ministry called Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementations, MOSPI, under which we have Central Statistical Organization, CSO. This CSO is responsible, or we can say the CSO provides these numbers, which are reported by the different news agencies in India. If we look at, this is a table I have taken from CSO. The link for the same is provided 2-3 slides down. So I'll ask you to look at those links I have provided and look for the recent statistics on India. As you can see, the table I have provided is for Q1, that is from April to June of 2021. You can look at the recent quarterly estimate, and it is one of your home assignment to look for those numbers, and they are part of your syllabus as well as text. So looking at this table, we observe that the contraction reported here is 22.6%, not the 23.9%. Why this difference? Because the news agencies reported what we call as a constant price collapse in GDP. Whereas here, if you read the table carefully, you observe this is at current prices. So we have difference between current prices as well as our constant prices. As the nomenclature suggests, constant prices implies we keep the price constant for a particular time period. And in case of India, now we are keeping the price constant at 2011-12 prices. And here if you see, the GDP collapsed by 23.9% in the first quarter of the financial year 2021. So we'll look at how we reach at those numbers, how we capture this GDP. So what is GDP? And how we measure it, we'll discuss this. For the time being, understand GDP as the monetary value of final goods and services the economy is producing at the time duration specified. Like in this case, what we mean by these GDP numbers is in April and June of 2021, how much goods and services we have produced and their monetary value represented at a 2011 and 12 prices is our GDP. We'll discuss it in a greater length, maybe 4-5 lectures down. Okay, so this constant price GDP, also known as your real GDP. Real GDP, since we are keeping the prices constant, so price changes are not affecting our value of the GDP. Therefore, the value of the GDP only can be varied because of the quantity of goods and services we are producing. Therefore, this real GDP can be proxied for what we call is a, in fact, real GDP per capita, which is GDP upon real GDP upon your populations, can be viewed as our standard of living. Though this proxy is subject to various limitations, as we will discuss in a later stage, but it is fairly well accepted concept that real GDP per capita can be a very good measure of our standard of living. So if we look at the sources, so this is the link I was talking about, that from where we have this data. So I'll share this PPT with you, and you can look at this link and look at these tables. These tables are directly taken from the CSO website, and you can look at these numbers, and I suggest you to look at the recent GDP numbers. So if we look at this gross domestic product for India, we see they have been increasing over the years steadily. At the same time, if we look at per capita income, they are also increasing. And if you compare these two graphs, you see the increase in our gross domestic product is more pronounced than that of your per capita income. Let me clarify it. This per capita income, strictly speaking, is not your per capita GDP. Per capita GDP. Though there is a considerable overlap between these two terminology, but they are not the same thing. We'll discuss this, what this per capita income implies, and then we'll see what is this per capita GDP. So your per capita income is national income divided by your population, where GDP is your per capita GDP is GDP upon your populations. So what we observe here is the per capita income grow relatively slowly compared to our GDP. And for India, we can find these informations at MOSPI, that is Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementations, as well as RBI, Reserve Bank of India. So these two provide the statistics related to uh, Indian economy, not only on GDP and its constituents, but also other economic variables on which you can get informations. If you are interested, you can visit these websites and look at other economic indicators of India. If you are interested to look at for other countries, then the link here provides you informations for other countries as well as India. Comparable informations are there, and if you are interested, you can visit and check them. However, I strongly suggest you visit this RBI website. Once you click on that link, you will be taken to this website, and you can look at particularly this macroeconomic aggregates at current and constant prices, as well as your per capita state domestic product at current and constant prices. You have other informations as well, but if you please look at those two informations for a better understanding of Indian economy. Now, moving to the world economy for the last, let's say, 100 years or so, what we observe from this graph, this figure presents us how the world has looked like in the last maybe 1000 years or so. If we look at this graph, we see we can make two observations very quickly. One is, if you see up to this, let's say 17th century, this part, the lines are flat. We can say the world was flat during this time period. And since 17th century, some of the countries have started to grow in terms of their real gross domestic product per capita, and the increase or moving out of this flat land has occurred to different countries at different point of time. For instance, if you see UK, it started maybe in the 17th century, but for India and let's say China, it started somewhere in the 19th century, in fact, in the second half of the 19th century. And similarly, if you look at, let's say, Japan or Italy, they started something around 1800, and let's say for Japan it was uh, late 18th century and so forth. So these are the few observations we make. The first one is there is a long history where the standard of living, average living standard has not been changed across the world. And when it start to change, it's changed very quickly. And the change has occurred for different countries at different point of time. So we are making these three statements out of these graph. In fact, in the 14th century, there was one Moroccan scholar who traveled across the globe named Ibn Battuta. Ibn Battuta, who traveled across the globe and traveled to India as well. And when he visited India in the 14th century, he noted, he visited Bengal, particularly in India, and he noted Bengal in India as a country of great extent and one in which rice is extremely abundant. Indeed, he mentioned that he had not seen no region of the earth in which provisions are so plentiful. So what he had observed, India was not richer than the other parts of the world, but India was not much poorer either, which we also see the difference between the living standard for different countries for whom we have some informations thanks to the Madison Project database. Those who devoted their Madison, who devoted his entire life to collect those scarce data for various countries so that we can compare the living standard of countries across the globe for a very long time period. So Ibn Battuta observed that the world was similar that time. But he also observed within a particular region, there was difference between rich and poor. So what he might have observed then, the rich and the poor in a particular region are maybe based on the titles given to them in that region. For instance, in case of India, those who were the landlords, they were the rich. The royals were the rich, but they are servants. The peasants, they were the poor. So the titles given to those uh, uh, were the rich, whereas those who were servant or the peasants, they were the uh, poor. So the prospect of one, whether rich or poor, depends upon whether you are born to the families belongs to the royals or the landlords, or the families born to the peasants or the laborer. So the prospect of one uh, individual depends on where his or her parents were on the economic ladder, whether the individual was male or female, and so forth. So the observations by Ibn Battuta, as maybe we can see, that the difference across the regions were small, but within a region, the difference, economic difference in terms of rich and poor, was significant, uh, and this is mostly observable from their titles. If someone is royals, then they are they are rich, and those who are servants, they were poor. So in that time period, in the 14th century, the provisions available to an average Indian was similar in the rest of the world as well, in terms of the access to food, medical care, shelter, and the other necessities of life. But if we compare this 14th century Indian or even the 16th century Indian to the current day, we see there is quite big difference of the average living standard of Indians, which is far below, let's say, UK, Japan, or Italy in today's world than it was in the 16th century or the 14th century. And this graph tell us this thing. So what we observe here is the vast majority of our history, regions were more or less equal, different regions, though there are inequality within the region on the basis of the titles given to some families or other. The regions were more or less similar in terms of their average living standard. However, this living standard started to change since 1700, and the changes had occurred at different time period for different countries, and the difference in the living standard start to grow between regions. Therefore, the inequality between the region have changed. So we see this inequality has been increasing across the countries. Now, when we are so this graph tells us the inequality rising between the countries. What about the inequality within the countries? Let's have a look at.
Uh, Excuse
Yeah,
me, sir, I have a question.
yeah, go ahead.
So, can you please go to previous slide, like the
Yes.
medicine project one?
Uh-huh.
So, why does the graph for India starts from 1600? and medicine project database. Like India has been contributing to world GDP since ancient times. So
Yeah, it's
why does this?
uh, why this India's data or the informations available for India, which they could collect and verify, is only available after the 16th century. So these informations available prior to this, they couldn't collect. They don't have those informations. That is why it is starting from 1600. Probably earlier, there are claims that India's contributions to the world economy was significant, but there are no documentations to prove such thing. Therefore, they refrain from putting those numbers, and because there are informations only available after 1600, that is why we are starting from here. And if you look for China, it started only after 16, say maybe 1640 or something like that. It is because the historical data are not very easy to access. Now, as we have this modern technology where we can store data for so many years, even large informations, then we didn't have those luxury. Therefore, it is very difficult to collect those informations as well as verify those informations so that they are acceptable. These informations provided by this Madison project, mostly they collected informations on OECD countries or the developed countries. Particularly, they started with UK. That is why for UK we have the longest informations of this real gross domestic product. That is simply because of the availability of informations, nothing else. It does not say anything other than that before 1600 what was India's position. They didn't claim that also, and neither we are claiming. Even if you look at these 1600 to 1700, for that 100 years, you see India's position relative to the others are in similar. Yeah. Yeah. Someone is saying something.
अबे नहीं देखा यार. अच्छा देख.
Sahil. MI33020. You are saying something.
No, sir. I was talking to my roommate. Sorry.
Okay. Mute yourself. So that is only the point for which we don't have informations for India before 1600. Probably India may be richer than others before 1600, but we don't have information to support those claims. But if we look at for India, even after 1600, let's say up to this phase, India's line was flat. So it didn't grow as much as, let's see, if you look it from 1600 to almost, let's say 1900, for these 300 years, there has hardly any change. But if you see, let's say from 1980 onwards, the second half of, we start to grow. Similarly for China and others. So the story remains similar for all the countries. What we observe for most of the countries is we have a hockey stick type of progress. That is, we have a very a long flat area. Then we have a kink and we start to grow like this. So whether we look at for India or for other countries, we have this hockey stick type of growth, and this kink which have happened for different countries at different point of time. So this is the point we are trying to make. So we have a long history, and how long is the history for the particular country? It varies from, let's say, informations available. But if you look at, all of them have a similar hockey stick type of progress in terms of your average living standard. Is it fine?
Sure, sir.
Oh. So yeah, now so we looked at here. We see once this kink has happened, the difference in the living standard start to differ for different countries. Let's say this is for one country. For another country, we have a flat area like this, and we have a stick like this, and so forth. So what you see, this kink has happened somewhere here for this country, but earlier you see the difference was very minimal, but here if you see, the difference start to enlarge. So we have increase in inequality between countries and among countries after the kink has happened in that hockey stick. Then the natural question arises, what happened to the inequality within the country? As Ibn Battuta in the 14th century had observed, there was inequality within the countries, and those inequalities were mostly driven by the titles given to some sections of the society, like the royals and the sheriffs in the say European unions, current European unions, and in case of India, it is landlord or the kings, those who are rich. And who are the poor? The peasants, the laborers, the servants, those were the poor. Okay, so now let's look at how the inequality has changed across or within the countries for maybe different countries. For different countries we look at. These three graphs represent those inequality in terms of our average incomes. Let me explain how these graphs been generated. That will facilitate us to understand it better. Initially, we have arranged the countries from poorest to the richest. So these are the countries named in the x-axis, where poorest country to the richest country, that is from red to green. And then for each country, like here, for each country, we have 10 groups. We have divided the populations 10 groups, from the poorest 10% to the richest 10%. So if I'm drawing let's say this is the country's name. Let's say this is for India. And in these directions for India, we have 10 what we call these groups we have. So from the 10% of poorest to the richest 10% of the populations. So the average income of the poorest 10, let's say, represented by this bar graph, and then the next 10% average income is like this, and let's say for the next 10% like this, so forth the last 10% like this. So we have such a graph. So for each each country we have these graph. So in the if you look at here, these are the bottom 10% populations across different countries, and in the back side here you see the richest 10% population's average income. So if we look at this graph, what we observe here is, you see the backside. Here, the bumpiness was little small. Here you can see the bumpiness has increased. And here you see the bumpiness has further increased. So what you see is the richest 10% populations of the of almost all countries has increased more than that of the poorest 10%. And also countries have moved from the say poorest countries to middle income countries and so forth. Like China here, which was one of the poorer country, now it has moved to somewhere here, sort of thing. Okay. So from this we can observe these facts. So the average income of the rich in every country have been much more than the poor. And in this context, we have a very handy measure of looking at how inequality has been changing over time. What we call is a 90/10 ratio. What this 90/10 ratio implies? The 90/10 ratio is, let me explain what is this 90/10 ratio first. So you take the richest 10% population's average income and divide it by the poorest 10% average income. That gives you the 90/10 ratio. So this, if we have, let's say, a income distribution like this, so what you can do is you can divide these income distributions into 10 decile groups, and this is the 10th decile, and let's say this is your 90th decile or the 90th percentile. So this is the 10th percentile. So the income of the populations below this 10th percentile and income of these richest 10% or the 90th percentile, that gives you the 90/10 ratio. That is why it is called the 90/10 ratio. So as this, let's say if the 90/10 ratio is 5. What it implies? It implies on an average, the richest 10% of the population in this country have income five times more than the poorest 10% of the population of that country. And this is a very rude way, or maybe very rudimentary way of looking at how inequality has been changing. And what we observe, this 90/10 ratio, even for the most equal society we consider today in this world, basically those Scandinavian countries are considered to be more equal societies, such as Norway, Sweden, and so forth. Those are considered very, what you can say, are the more equal economy. For Norway, this 90/10 ratio is 5.4. And for US, it is 60. And this 90/10 ratio is the highest for poorer countries. For example, the Botswana, the sub-Saharan countries Botswana, which is recently has been growing at a very high growth rate, as a 90/10 ratio of 145. So what you see is the richest 10% populations of Botswana, on an average, 145 times more income than the poorest 10% of Botswana population. The other thing we observe from these figures, that if we look at the richest 10% in poor countries, and compare them with the poorest 10% of the rich countries, we see there is a massive difference. For instance, if we compare the richest 10% population in Nigeria and compare with the poorest 10% of the Norway, then the richest in Nigeria on an average have half the income of the poorest in the Nigeria, or poorest in the Norway. So poorest in the Norway have more income than the richest in the Nigeria. So that suggests there has been not only rise in inequality within the countries, as we observe from the 90/10 ratio, and as we see from the increasing skyscrapers at the back of this graph. So the skyscrapers at the back of these graphs presents the average income of the richest in the country, and At the same time, the difference between the countries also increase that we are also observed here. So these are the two things we have observed for these from these two graphs. What that these two things are, for a very long time, living standard did not grow in any sustained way. When sustained growth happened, it started at different times for different countries, and which has leading to difference in the living standard around the world. So we observe that there is a vast time period where we see there is hardly any difference amongst the countries, but when this kink has happened in this hockey stick, this kink has happened for different countries at a different point of time, and that has led to difference in the living standard. Here as we see difference in the living standard. The kink has happened for United Kingdom in the 17th century. For India, it is maybe the late 19th century, and we see the difference is quite significant. But if you compare it with, let's say, Italy, the kink has started somewhere in the, let's say, 18th century, and the difference is smaller and so forth. So these are the two observations we could make out of these set of graphs. And understanding how this has occurred has been one of the most important questions that we asked. Starting from the founder of economics, who started to observe these facts at that time, try to explain these phenomena, what we are observing. And he wrote a book as the founding member of economics, Adam Smith. That book titled as An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of the Nations, where he tried to provide answer to these phenomena we have observed through these graphs. Though for him, there is no graph or no information as such as we can look at, but what he had observed in his life, that was similar to this type of situations, and then he tried to answer those important questions. So Adam Smith asked, how can society coordinate the independent activities of large numbers of economic actors? Who are those economic actors? Those economic actors are producers, transporters, sellers, consumers, and so forth. And these economic actors are that time mostly unknown to each other. Nowadays, with the say advancement of our technology, we know many of the producers or the transporter. But at that time, when he wrote in 1776 that book, that time those economic actors were unknown to each other. Then he asked, how these unknown economic agents are coordinating amongst themselves. So, was there any force from the outside that is forcing those economic actors to coordinate amongst themselves? Or it was something else? What he claimed, or what he claimed that this coordination by those unknown economic agents was not because of somebody enforcing that coordination, but that coordination has or was generated spontaneously without any person or any institutions deliberately attempt to create or maintain that coordinations. So his claim was radical in that sense. You think of the world in 1776, where most of the world was ruled by kings or maybe rulers, where the rulers dictated those what someone has to do and what someone has not to do and so forth. But his claim was radical because he said that, yeah, no one is enforcing it, the coordination. The coordination was spontaneous. And this spontaneous coordination, he argued, was because of the self-interest of those economic actors. There was a famous statement made by him, I quote, that it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. What it implies is that the dinner we are getting was not because of the selfless act of those who are providing it, but because of their self-interest, they are providing it to us. So then he claimed how this GDP has been increasing at that time, particularly in Britain and in around. His claim was it was the division of labor or specialization which is constrained by the extent of the market is promoting this expansion of our GDP. So what was his claim? How, say, once we have started this king here, why we have increasing like this at that time period? He claimed that it is the specialization or the division of labor which is limited by the extent of the market, is causing this expansion, is what's causing this expansion. He had illustrated his claim through a simple example of pin factory. What is this division of labor and how it is helping in expansions of our production, and how it is limited by our extent of our market. So the first point is the division of labor or the specialization is helping for this expansion. And why we are not expanding unlimited? He claimed this expansion is constrained by the extent of the market. So let us take his example to understand what he meant by this specialization leading to expansion of our productions and hence GDP, and that has been not unlimited or not unbounded, but it is bounded because there is what you call is the extent of the market. So in his famous pin factory example, what he noted that in a pin factory, what we have is there are 18 distinct operations to be made. There are 18 activities you can think of. 18 activities that has been made. So such as one has to bring the wire, another has to let's say straighten in, and the other activities to cut it, then into sharp it, and maybe do other things. So there are 18 distinct operations. If one person conduct all 18 distinct operations of producing a pin, then that one individual in a day may produce very limited number of pins. Let's say can produce only 50 pins. So one individual doing all 18 activities can produce only 50 pins per day. But if we have, say, 10 individuals, each one of them is only working on one or maximum of 2 activity or the operations, then they will produce maybe 50,000 pins. So if take one individual doing everything, 50 pins, 10 individual doing only one part of the operations, or maximum two parts of the operations, then 50,000 pins. So this 10 individual per head, they are producing 5,000 pins. When one individual working alone producing 50, but 10 individual together, they are dividing their activities so that one individual will operate only on one operation or one distinct activities. Then they are producing, each one of them are producing on an average 5,000. So you see, production has increased because of what we call is specialization. Specialization, or what you call is the division of labor in his language. Division of labor. So here we have division of labor. So one is working only in a particular activity. So this has increased production significantly. You see here. But once you have produced so many, what you will do? You cannot consume all of them. So you have to sell them in the market. If you want to sell them, if you do not have a purchaser for this, then will you go on producing? No. This is what we mean by the how much you produce is limited by the extent of market. And because of this specialization, which has fostered the or increased production, that has fostered the increase of our international trade. So when you produce so many pins, what you'll do? You'll try to sell them in, say, another country. For that, we need our transportations and navigation canals and so forth. So this foreign trade expansion, which was fostered by the specializations, fostered by this specialization, what that was his claim. So this pin factory illustrated, the pin factory example has illustrated how this division of labor or the specialization had increased our production, but this increased production was limited by the extent of our market. So Smith, because of his argument that people are, or the economic agents are coordinating themselves because of their self-interest, and the prosperity in terms of our production rise was because of the specializations, he is often associated with the idea that prosperity arises from the pursuit of self-interest under free market conditions. Further, when this kink had happened for some countries, like in the 17th century or the early 18th century, this phase, for many countries, particularly in Europe, this phase also coincided with what we call is the technological revolution. And this technological revolution has in fact helped in the improved specialization. The specializations, what Smith had observed, was facilitated by the technological revolutions happened during that time period. There was, in fact, remarkable scientific and technological advancements occurred in human history. But in this phase, 17th century to 18th century, particularly in around Europe, what was there are important new technology were introduced in textile industry, in energy, transportation sectors. And the cumulative characteristics of this technological improvement in textile, energy, and transportation sector are known as what we call as the industrial revolution. So, what we observe is in that time period, say in the early 18th century and so forth, we had significant technological advancement occurred. And this technological advancement occurred in textile, in energy and transportation sector in around Europe. The cumulative effect of this is what we call is the industrial revolution that had transformed the the Britain economy, which was earlier an agrarian economy or agriculture based economy, to an industrial economy. That is why this is called the industrial revolutions. So when we are talking about technological revolutions and industrial revolution, which is part of that, what we mean by technology? Its usage, technology maybe refers to machine, equipment, and devices developed using scientific knowledge. However, in economics, technology has a specific meaning. Technology implies in economics a process that takes a set of material and other inputs, including the work of people and machines, and creates an output. So in economics, technology is different. Meaning of technology is different than what we commonly use in our day-to-day life. So technology implies we are taking a set of inputs. This set of inputs are both our material inputs. The other one is our people or workers. And the third one is our, what you call is the machines and so forth. We take this set of inputs and then produce an output. The process, what we are calling, is technology. So, what is technological progress? We have defined what is technology. Then what is this technological progress? Technological progress implies a change in technology that reduce the amount of resources or the inputs required to produce a given amount of output. Or let's say we have these three inputs, the material inputs, we have workers, and then we have machines. We take this set of inputs and produce our output. Let's say we take the same set of inputs using, let's say, technology 1, T1, and produce output O. Now we take the same set of inputs, materials, workers, and machines, and let's say use another technology too and produce, let's say, output O1. If our O1 is greater than O, then we'll say from technology 1 to technology 2, there is a technological advancement or technological progress. One of the example of technological progress, we can see today the productivity of labor in terms of producing light. In our primitive world, when we are producing light, probably it took 4-5 men and women, maybe complete whole day produced to produce light in the evening or so forth. Now, if we want to produce light, we are producing light only on a switching on one switch or something like that. So what we see is there has been technological advancement that has increased our labor productivity. And if we see our labor productivity, this also for a vast majority time period, it has remained constant. But once we have this technological progress starting, say, in around that 17th and 18th century, we have a hockey stick type of growth. So what we see is not only real per capita GDP, which is followed a hockey stick type of pattern, but labor productivity also been seen as following such type of hockey stick type of path. The other thing is, if you look at the technological progress, we can look at it from how connected we are currently. If you remember 1857 Indian troops against mutiny of Indian troops against British rule in 1857, that time it took around 46 days to reach the information to London that there has been a mutiny of Indian troops against British rule in India. But if you now see how these informations pass, you see anything happening, let's say in US, we know it maybe instantly, maybe in 10 seconds or so. So like in the Capitol riot which had happened earlier in US, that spread to rest of the world in no time. Similarly, anything happening in, say, Japan or maybe Europe, we are able to know it at that very instant. So this also show how technological progress has been, and we see that how the information has been passed has been following a similar type of hockey stick type of path. So what we observe that not only our GDP, which is following such type of holistic type of path, but also the labor productivity and how the informations or the news spread, the time, the speed at which this news spread, they are also following this hockey stick type of path. Furthermore, there are other important natural uh, activities, those who are following also similar pattern of hockey stick type. So when we are talking about this natural, then what we see is our economy, which is we are more interested here. It's part of our this natural environment, this physical environment. So our economy is a part of a larger social system, which is itself a part of the biosphere, and people interact with each other and also with nature in producing this livelihood. So we cannot leave out our, say, natural environment when we are talking about our economy. We should be concerned about our physical environment, biosphere, as well as society, because we are part of that bigger picture. And in terms of this, how are there anything that shows or that help us to understand this hockey stick type of growth we observe for our economy, like your real per capita? If we look at what we call is the atmospheric carbon dioxide, this also follow a similar pattern. And as you see, the kink is around that same time period also. Also, if you look at global carbon emissions, for which we have some little information, we see also they have started, the kink has started in around that time period. So what we have observed here is not only our economy indicators such as our real GDP per capita, but also there are elements or maybe indicators in our physical environment. They are also following a typical pattern. So what we observe here in those set of graphs I had shown you, that we have this hockey stick type of progress in gross domestic product per capita, productivity of labor in terms of our light per hour of work, and your connectivity of various parts of the world, that the speed at which news travel, and then impact of the economy on the global environment in terms of our carbon emissions and climate change. All of them are following similar pattern. So natural question arises: how can we explain the change from a world in which living conditions change little unless there was epidemic or war, to one in which each generation is witnessing observable changes. So what we observe here is, for a vast period, we didn't see any changes in the our world, but now we are observing changes. We are observing changes, and we are observing changes which are noticeable from generation to generation. Even within a generation, we are observing such changes. How can we explain those? And one of the important part of our answer to these questions, how can we explain these changes, where we didn't see any change at all for maybe 1000 years or so, but now within say 20-30 years, we are observing significant changes. How can we explain that? An important part of our answer lies in what we call as the capitalist revolution. And this capitalist revolution, which has the emergence in the 18th century in the Europe and eventually spread across the globe, is probably partially responsible, if not completely responsible, for this fast changing world. So what is this capitalism? So capitalism is an economic system in which there are three things that guide the productions and distributions of goods and services in the economy. So capitalism is an economic system where there are three things that guide the productions and the distribution of goods and services. What are those three things? These are the three, what we call as the institutions of capitalism. One is your private properties. The other one is your market. The third one is your farms. So capitalism is an economic system where the institutions such as your private properties, market, and farms organize the production and distribution of goods and services. So capital here, as we say, this capitalism is an economic system where there are three institutions: private property, markets, and farms, that organize and distribute, organize production and distributions of goods and services. So what do you mean by institutions? Institutions implies the different set of laws and social custom regulating production and distribution in different ways. So by institutions, we mean the different set of laws and social custom regulating production and distributions of goods and services. So as I said, I'll leave you a bit early. So today I'll stop here. We'll continue from this capitalism in our next class. If you have any
Sir,
query,
if there's any soft copy of a textbook that you would like to share, can you please share?
I didn't get you exactly what you mean by that. I believe
A reference book that you want to suggest, or you have a soft copy of it, can you please share it with us?
okay, let me stop recording.